We're talking about the Volkswagen emissions scandal. The scandal, commonly known as Dieselgate, occurred when the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, revealed Volkswagen's violations of US regulatory Clean Air Act standards. It was found that Volkswagen had rigged their emission tests with a defeat device. The defeat switch knew when testing was occurring through various parameters such as position of steering, speed, and etc. A switch controlled the diesel output, which made the NOx trap more efficient and as a result produced low NO emissions, but the results differed when it came to driving performance on the road. Due to this, the emissions on the road were 40 times more than what was allowed by regulatory standards. After that, Volkswagen admits to having installed the defeat switch on up to 11 million cars, although not all were recalled. In terms of timeline, about when Volkswagen was caught, the CEO of Volkswagen resigned, but declaring being not aware of any wrongdoing on my part. In December, Volkswagen said only a few number of workers were involved in the scandal. At March, it revealed that the CEO had received memos about the scandal, but insinuates no one whistleblowed publicly or any governing body. So the question arises is who is to blame, and did the engineers involved fulfill their ethical and legal duty? All these sections in the Code of Misconduct and Code of Ethics were violated, although some more seriously than others. To elaborate upon serious ones, Section 72.A, negligence, because the engineers act to avoid solving the problem of the emissions above regulatory standards by designing a system to cheat the emissions test. Section 77.2D and G go hand in hand, as the Clean Air Act was violated while the engineer's responsibility was to ensure emissions met regulatory standards. Furthermore, from Section 77.1I and 77.2I, the fidelity and welfare to the public and the environment was violated, as their advertisement of an eco-friendly car was a dishonest claim. And finally, from Section 77.8, the engineers should have exposed the company for their unethical actions of developing a defeat switch. The decisions come down to the option number 1, doing nothing, which will result in later exposure and engineers held for their negligence. Number 2, discuss with supervisors, and if they are not responsive, remind them of the newspaper test, and after further inaction from the move up to the chain of command to the CEO. If nothing gets done, by approaching the CEO, the next but not preferable move would be to report to the PEO, which risks violating company disclosure rules and potential loss of employment. And finally, the least preferable option to whistleblow to the public. We think that the best ethical decision would be to fulfill their duty to report by moving up the chain of command and reporting to the PEO as a last resort. Now for the defendants and the plaintiffs in this case. The legal precedents that are applicable to this case are Donahue v. Stevenson and Wolverine Tube v. Noranda and Arthur Little for tort law. Meanwhile, Rylands v. Fletcher and Smith v. Inco can be applicable for environmental law. And lastly, Derry v. Speak can be applied as contractual law, as misrepresentation had occurred in this case. In tort law, there are 3 main principles that need to be addressed, which are the duty of care, breaching the duty of care, and essentially the results of breaching the duty of care. The cheat devices created by Volkswagen allowed the company to formulate false data in order to illegally pass environmental regulations, inevitably leading to financial injury. The Paris Accord is an agreement within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change dealing with acts such as greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. There are 4 criteria that were examined in order to further analysis of the case and arrive at the final decision. Volkswagen went severely over the standards of emissions, which went against the acts such as CEPA and EPA due to the abnormally large amounts of greenhouse gases the vehicles were actually producing, which Volkswagen was consciously aware of, essentially lowering air quality and property value and increasing health risks. Misrepresentation is a form of contract law. Volkswagen was specifically fraudulent in their actions because they were aware of their statements being deliberately false. Ultimately, we are aware that Volkswagen lied and cheated on their emissions tests by creating a cheat device to fabricate praised environmental standards. They ironically launched a Think Blue campaign to title themselves as the most ecological sustainable car manufacturer in the world by 2018 and easily went against the trust of the general public. In terms of potential liabilities that Volkswagen faces, there are legal fees, fines set out by government regulations, and the public can claim damages and dissolve contract with Volkswagen of purchased vehicles, and many more. For the final decision of this case, the defendant, Volkswagen, will likely be found guilty for the 3 legal structures we've discussed, and the liabilities they'd incurred would be a mix of the 3. Due to tort law, they'd be liable to the state had the incident not occurred. Thus, they'd have to pay punitive fees such as buyback of their vehicles and consequential damages such as legal fees. From environmental laws, the defendant would likely be charged fines set up by the government institutions. General punitive damages from civilians would likely not be won from environmental law due to Smith versus Inco, as it is very difficult to rule that Volkswagen vehicles themselves are cause for lower air quality, property value, or increased health risks. Volkswagen will probably not be held liable unless there is concrete evidence that, because of their actions, general/punitive damages occurred. However, Volkswagen will probably be held liable for the general punitive damages under misrepresentation, since their conduct can easily be proven as fraudulent and were trying to deceive. As a result, they are liable for all losses due to their conduct, whether they are forcibly or not.